What's up, handsome? Hello and welcome back to Storytime. I am Sunny, Storytime with Sunny, and today we're going to be starting 20,000, no it's not 2,000, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne's. Hey Kickin'! Well, I like to leave a little bit of a gap between when I go on air and when I actually start, just so that, people can have a little bit of time to come in, so they don't come in the middle of chapter 1 or something like that, which, that's totally fine because I put all of my streams up on YouTube. But I like to at least start the stream even with the starting soon image at exactly 2 o'clock. Yeah, try to keep some consistencies. So anyways, this is Jules Verne. If you're not familiar with him, he is believed to be one of the great inspirations of the steampunk era, or not the steampunk era, but the whole steampunk aesthetic with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and and he went on to earn acclaim as the father of science fiction. So he's a pretty important person in in literature and also in pop culture, not only for science fiction but also with steampunk. Like I think that The Time Machine was another one of his, and yeah, I love seeing people's interpretations of his machines. Ooh, wonderful. Nice. Maybe this will give you some inspiration. I'm hoping it'll give me some inspiration because, as you can see, I have the underwater image kind of as a placeholder until I do my own art for the stream, and I didn't want to go into the art without the description that Jules Verne gives. So, yeah, we'll see what this inspires in us. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I like to try to not interact with chat in the middle of chapters, but I will take a pause between chapters to reply and all that stuff, just so that I can keep the flow going. So let's go ahead and get started. Part 1, Chapter 1, A Moving Rock. The year 1866 was marked by a very strange event, an inexplicable and unexplained phenomenon which must still be in the recollection of our readers. Without mentioning rumors which agitated the population of the seaports and extended to the interior of various countries, the maritime population were more particularly exercised in their minds. Merchants, ship owners, ship captains, skippers, and masters, both European and American, officers of the marines of both countries, and, subsequently, the government of various states of these continents were deeply engrossed respecting this phenomenon. As a matter of fact, for some time many vessels had encountered an enormous thing, long, spindle-shaped, phosphorescent at times, very much larger and swifter than a whale. The facts relating to this apparition, as recorded in various logs, agreed sufficiently respecting the formation of the object, or being, in question, the unheard-of celebrity of its movements, its wonderful power of motion, the peculiar life with which it seemed endowed. If it were of the whale species, it exceeded in bulk all that science had hitherto classified. Neither Cuvier, nor Lacépède, nor Dumeril, nor Monsieur de Quatrefages, these are interesting names, had admitted the existence of such a monster. But to strike a medium of the observations made at intervals, rejecting the timid estimates which pronounced this object to be 200 feet long, and putting away the exaggerated opinions which gave it a breadth of 1 mile and a length of 3, we may state, nevertheless, that this extraordinary being exceeded anything hitherto discovered by ichthyologists, supposing it ever existed. Now, if it existed, the fact could not be denied, and with the instinct for the marvelous indulged in by the average brain of humanity, one can understand the effect produced upon the world by this supernatural apparition. It was quite impossible to treat it as a mere fable. In fact, upon the 20th July, 1866, the steamer Governor Higginson of the Calcutta and Burnash Steam Navigation Company had encountered this moving mass 5 miles to the east of Australia. Captain Baker was at first under the impression that he had met with an unknown rock and was prepared to take the bearings of it, when 2 columns of water impeded by this extraordinary object were spurted 150 feet into the air. So unless this rock were subject to the intermittent expansions of a geyser, the Governor Higginson had in good earnest encountered some aquatic mammifer. I guess that's a mammal, underwater mammal, hitherto unknown, which spurted through its blowholes 2 columns of water mixed with air and steam. A singular occurrence was observed on the 23rd July in the same year in the Pacific Ocean by the Christopher Columbus of the West India and Pacific Steam Navigation Company. On this occasion, the wonderful cetacean must have moved from place to place with extreme velocity, since the Governor Higginson and the Christopher Columbus had observed it at 2 places separate more than 700 nautical leagues. 15 days later, 2,000 leagues from the above latitude, the Helvetica of the National Steamship Company and the Shannon of the Royal Mail, sailing between Europe and America, noticed the monster respectively 42 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 60 degrees 35 minutes west longitude of the meridian of Greenwich, in this simultaneous observation the minimum length of the mammifer was estimated at 350 feet, for the Shannon and the Helvetica were smaller than it, inasmuch as they measured 300 feet only from stem to stem. Now the very largest whale, those which inhabit the neighborhood of the Aleutian Islands, Kalamack and Umgilick, have never exceeded 150 feet or 180 feet, even if they reach that length. These reports arrived in quick succession. Further observations made on board the transatlantic liner Pereire, I guess it is Pereire, a collision report a collision between the Etna of the Inman line and the monster. An official report sent in by the officers of the French frigate La Normandie, a very serious report obtained by the Secretary of State from Commodore Fitz James, of the Lord Clyde stirred up public curiosity. In a country possessing some sense of humor, the subject would have been treated as a joke, but in such grave and practical nations as England, America, and Germany, people were very much exercised in their mind. In the large towns, this monster became quite the rage. They sung about it in the cafes, they derided it in the newspapers, and joked about it in the theaters. The canards had now every opportunity to lay eggs of every color. One might have noticed in the papers drawings and descriptions of all the terrible and imaginary beings, from the white whale, the fearful Moby Dick of the Arctic regions, the immense kraken whose tentacles were sufficient to grasp a ship of 500 tons and drag it to the depths of the oceans. They produced even the statements of ancient writers, the opinions of Aristotle and Pliny, who had admitted the existence of these monsters, the Norwegian narratives of the Bishop Pontoppidan, the tales of Paul Hegede, and finally the reports of Mr. Harrington, whose good faith no one could impugn, when he declared that he had seen, when on board the Castellan in 1857, that enormous serpent which up to that time had only infested the waters of the ancient Constitutional. Then there arose the interminable discussion between the credulous and the incredulous amongst scientific societies and publications. This monster question inflamed their mind. Journalists, who professed themselves scientific in contradiction to those who professed to be intellectual, slung ink to a great extent during this memorial campaign. Some even shed a few drops of blood, for the sea serpent gave rise to some very offensive personalities. For 6 months this paper war continued with varying success. To the leading articles of the Geographical Institute of Brazil, of the Royal Academy of Sciences at Berlin, of the British Association, of the Smithsonian Institute at Washington, to the discussions in the Indian archipelago, in the Cosmos of the Abbé Moignot, in the Mittelungen of Petermann, in the scientific notices of France and other journals, the comic papers replied with unflagged energy, their lively writers parodying a speech of Linnaeus, quoted by the opponents of the monster, maintained in effect that nature did not do foolish things, and adjured their contemporaries not to give nature the lie by admitting the existence of krakens, sea serpents, Moby Dick, and other inventions of drunken sailors. At first, in the very celebrated satirical journey, the editor attacked the monster, gave him a last blow, and conquered amid universal laughter. Wit had vanquished science. During the first months of the year 1867, the question remained in abeyance, and did not appear likely to crop up again, when suddenly some new facts were brought to the knowledge of the public. These did not take the shape of a scientific problem which had to be solved, but in an actual danger to be avoided. Thus the question assumed a totally different aspect. The monster was still an islet, a rock, a reef, but a moving rock, interminable and unassailable. On the 5th March, 1867, the Moravian of the Montreal Ocean Company, in 27 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, 17 degrees 52 minutes west longitude, during the night, struck on the starboard quarter a rock which no chart had ever laid down. Impelled by steam and wind, this vessel was progressing at the rate of 13 knots. Had the Moravian not been very stoutly built, she would have sprung a leak and have gone to the bottom with her 237 passengers and crew. The accident happened at about 5 a.m. at daybreak. The officers of the watch hurried to the stern of the ship. They scanned the ocean with minuteness. They perceived nothing except a strong eddy which broke about 2 cables' length distance, as if the surface of the sea had been violently disturbed. The bearings of the spot were acutely taken, and the Moravian continued her voyage apparently uninjured. Had she struck upon a sunken rock or on some wreckage? They could not tell, but upon examination in dock, it was discovered that a portion of the keel had been carried away. This occurrence, although sufficiently serious in itself, would perhaps have been forgotten like many others, if 3 weeks afterward it had not occurred again under exactly similar conditions. Only, thanks to the nationality of the ship, the victim of this system of running foul of vessels, and to the reputation of the company to which the ship belonged, the event created a great sensation. No one can be ignorant of the name of Cunard, the celebrated English shipowner. This gentleman founded in 1840 a postal service between Liverpool and Halifax, NS. I don't remember what that stands for, with 3 wooden vessels and engines of 400 horsepower and 1,162 tons measurement. 8 years afterwards, the fleet of the company had increased by 4 ships of 650 horsepower and 1,820 tons, and 2 years later 2 other steamers of great size were built. In 1853, the Cunard Company, which had again secured the concession of carrying the mails, added sufficiently to its fleet. The Arabia, Persia, China, Scotia, that's probably Nova Scotia, Java, Russia, all vessels of the first class and the largest, except the Great Eastern, that had ever crossed the ocean. Thus, in 1867, the company possessed 12 ships, 8 paddle and 4 screw steamers. I give these details so that everyone may appreciate the importance of this company in maritime affair. No enterprise connecting with the transatlantic transport has been conducted with such ability or crowned with so great success. For 26 years the Cunard liners had crossed the Atlantic and had never missed a voyage, had experienced no serious delay, nor even lost a man, a letter, or a vessel. So passengers chose them still, notwithstanding the great competition, as can be perceived from an abstract from the official reports. Under those circumstances, it is not surprising that some excitement should have been created when the news came of an accident that had happened to one of the best steamers. On 13th April, 1867, the sea was smooth, the wind light, and the Scotia was at 15 degrees 12 minutes west longitude, 45 degrees 7 minutes north latitude. She was steaming over the 13 knots. Her draft of water was about 6 meters and a half, her displacement 6,680 cubic meters. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while dinner was proceeding in the saloon, a shock, but not a very great one, was distinctly felt somewhere in the starboard quarter, abaft the paddles. The Scotia had not struck. It had been struck, and moreover by some sharp or pointed thing which contused her. This hulling of the vessel was so gentle that no one on board would have felt anxious, had not someone run upon the bridge and exclaimed, "We're sinking! We're sinking!" Of course the passengers immediately took alarm, but Captain Anderson soon reassured them. Indeed, the danger could not be imminent, as the Scotia is divided into 7 watertight compartments, and can put up with a little leakage. Captain Anderson descended at once into the hold. He perceived that the 5th compartment had sprung a leak, and the rate at which the water was pouring in proved that the injury was of considerable extent. Very fortunately, the surfaces were not situated in this portion of the ship, else they would have been quickly extinguished. Captain Anderson stopped the Scotia and sent out one of the sailors to examine the injury. He soon discovered a large hole in the hull. Such damage could not be trifled with, and the Scotia was put at half speed for the rest of the voyage. She was then 300 miles from Cape Clear, and, after a delay of 3 days, which caused great anxiety in Liverpool, she arrived in port. The surveyors then set about their examination of the Scotia, which was dry-docked for the purpose. They could scarcely believe their eyes. About 6 feet above the below the waterline there was a regular rent in the shape of an isosceles triangle. The fissure in the iron plating was perfectly even, and could not have been more neatly done with a punch. It must have been caused by the instrument of no common hardness, and after it had been launched against the ship with such prodigious force as to pierce an enormous hole in the iron, it had been withdrawn by a retrograde movement almost inconceivable. This was the last occurrence which had so excited public curiosity. From that time all disasters at sea which could not be accounted for were put to the credits of the monster. This fantastic animal bore the responsibility of all shipwrecks, whose numbers were, alas, considerable, for out of the 3,000 vessels whose loss is annually recorded, the number supposed to be lost, because no intelligence concerning them has been received, scarcely reaches 200. Now this was the monster which, justly or unjustly, was accused of these destructions, and, thanks to him, the communication between the continents became more and more dangerous, and the public demanded that the ocean should be cleared of this formidable cetacean. So we've reached the end of the first chapter. I'm just going to take a moment. What is the gobblewonker? I've never heard of that. Ooh, interesting. I'll have to look that up after the stream. Sounds interesting. Oh, okay. Ooh. Okay, so chapter 2, For and Against. While the events above described were taking place, I was returning from a scientific expedition into the wild territory of Nebraska, USA. In my position as assistant professor to the Natural History Museum in Paris, the French government had nominated me to the expedition. After 6 months passed in Nebraska, I arrived in New York about the end of March, in charge of a valuable collection. I had arrived to sail for France at the beginning of May. In the meantime, I was occupying myself in classifying my mineral, botanical, and zoological collections, when the accident happened to the Scotia. I was perfectly well acquainted with the topic of the day. How could it be otherwise? I had read again and again the European and American journals without being any more enlightened. This mystery puzzled me. In the impossibility to form an opinion, I drifted from one extreme to the other. That there was something was an undoubtable fact, and the unbelieving were invited to put their fingers into the side of the Scotia. When I arrived in New York, the subject was being freely discussed. The hypotheses of the floating island, and the unassailable rock, upheld by some minds, had been altogether abandoned. And indeed, unless this rock possessed a machine in its interior, how could it move at such a tremendous pace? The floating hull of some large wreckage vessel was also set aside as untenable, and for the same reason. There thus remained 2 possible solutions to the question, which called into existence 2 distinct clans or cliques: those who believed in the monster of enormous size, and, on the other hand, those who supported the idea of a submarine vessel of a wonderful motive power. Now this last hypothesis, allowable after all, could not be supported in face of the inquiry directed against it. That any one person had such a mechanical power at his disposal was scarcely likely. Where and when had he manufactured it, and how had he kept the construction a secret? The government only could have possessed of such a destructive machine, and in these disastrous days, when everyone is bending his energies to multiply the effect of offensive weapons, it was possible that one state might, unknown to others, attempt such a formidable engine. After chassepôts, torpedoes, after torpedoes, submarine rams, then a reaction. At least I hope so. But the suggestion of an engine of war was dissipated by the declarations of various governments. As the question agitated was a public interest. Since interoceanic communications was being interrupted, the statement of the government could not be called in question. Moreover, how could the construction of such a machine have escaped notice? To guard such a secret under the circumstances would be a very difficult task for an individual, and certainly impossible for a state, whose acts are jealously watched by powerful rivals. So, after inquiries had been instituted in England, France, Russia, Prussia, Spain, Italy, America, and even Turkey, the suggestion of a submarine monitor was definitely rejected. The monster appeared by fits and starts, in spite of the incessant fire of jokes directed against it by the comic press. In this direction, imagination went to the most absurd lengths in fantastic ichthyology. On my arrival at New York, many people had done me the honor of to consult me upon the phenomenon in question. I had already published in France a work in 2 volumes quarto, entitled The Mysteries of the Great Ocean Depths. This work, which was much relished by the scientific world, dubbed me a specialist in this somewhat obscure branch of natural history. My opinion was asked. So long as I could deny the reality of the occurrence, I took refuge in absolute denial, but soon, driven to the wall, I was obliged to explain categorically the Honorable Pierre Anarax, professor of the museum in Paris, was formally called upon by the New York Herald to pronounce an opinion. I complied with the request because I was unable to remain silent. I discussed the question in all its bearings, politically and scientifically, and I give below an abstract from a well-digested article which I published in the issue of the 30th April. Thus, said I, after having examined one by one of the various hypotheses, all other suppositions being rejected, we must necessarily admit the existence of a marine animal of great power. The profound depths of the ocean are extremely unknown to us. Soundings have never reached to the bottom. What goes on in these abysses? What beings inhabit or can inhabit the regions 12 or 15 miles beneath the surface of the water? What is their organization? One can scarcely even conjecture. Nevertheless, the solution of the problem which has been submitted to me assumes this shape. Either we are acquainted with all the varieties of beings which inhabit our planet, or we are not. If we do not know them all, if nature has still secrets from us in ichthyology, nothing can be more rational than to admit the existence of fishes or cetacea, of new species, or even new genera, of an essentially primary organization, which inhabit the beds of the ocean inaccessible to the sounding line, and which some accident of fancy or caprice, if they will it, impels at long intervals to the upper waters of the oceans. If, on the contrary, we do know all living species, we must necessarily seek for the animal in question amongst the marine animals already catalogued, and in this event I am disposed to admit the existence of a gigantic narwhal. The common narwhal or sea unicorn often attains a length of 60 feet. 5 or 10 times this extent would give to this cetacean a force proportionate to its size. Increase its offensive power, and you obtain the animal you desire. It will have the proportions mentioned by the officers of the Shannon, the instrument needed for the perforation of the Scotia, and the force necessary to pierce the hull of a steamer. As a fact, that narwhal is armed with an ivory sword, or halberd, as some naturalists have termed it.
It is a tooth of the hardness of steel. Some of these teeth have been discovered in the bodies of whales, which the narwhal can attack with success. They have also been extracted, and not without labor, from the hulls of ships, which have been pierced through and through, as a gimlet pierces a cask. The Museum of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris contains one of these weapons, 2 meters and a quarter in length, and 48 centimeters broad at the base. Well then, suppose a weapon 10 times as powerful and the animal 10 times as great as the ordinary narwhal. Let it rush through the water at the rate of 20 miles an hour. Multiply the mass by the velocity, and you will obtain a resultant capable of producing the shock required. So far as information can go, I am of opinion that this monster is a sea unicorn, or of colossal dimensions, armed not merely with a halberd, but with a veritable spur like an ironclad or ram, possessing at the same time a force and motive power in proportion. Thus I can explain this almost inexplicable phenomenon, unless there is really nothing at all, in spite of all that has been seen, written, and felt, which is still possible. These last words were rather weak on my part, but I wished, up to a certain point, to shroud myself in my dignity as a professor, and not to give the Americans anything to ridicule, for they laugh well when they do laugh. I reserved a loophole for myself. In my heart, I admitted the existence of the monster. My article was warmly criticized, and this gave it popularity. It gained a number of adherents. The solution it advanced also gave free scope to the imagination. The human mind is pleased with great conceptions and supernatural beings. Now the sea is precisely the best vehicle for them, the sole medium where these giants, compared to which terrestrial animals, elephants or rhinoceroses, but are dwarfs, can be produced and developed. These ocean depths contain the largest known species of mammalia, and perhaps contain mollusks of unheard of size, crustacea, frightful to behold, such as lobsters of 100 meters and crabs weighing 200 tons. Why not? Formerly terrestrial animals of the geological epochs, the quadrupeds, apes, reptiles, and birds, were all formed upon gigantic models. The Creator cast them in a colossal mold, which time has by degrees reduced. Why cannot the sea, which never changes, while the earth is ever changing, still retain in its unknown depths these immense specimens of the animal life of former ages? Why cannot it hide within its bosom the last varieties of this titanic species, whose years are centuries, and whose centuries thousands of years? But I must not indulge in unbecoming speculations. A truce of these fancies, which time has shown to me are terrible realities. I repeat the opinion, when expressed, of the nature of the phenomenon, and the public admits without question the existence of an enormous being which has nothing in common with the fabulous sea serpents. But if one party saw in this nothing but a specific problem to be solved, the others, more positive above all in England and America, were anxious to impugn the ocean of its redoubtable monster, so as to secure safety in transatlantic communication. The commercial and trade journals took the matter up mainly with this view. The Shipping and Mercantile Gazette, Lloyd's List, the Steamboat, the Maritime and Colonial Review, all the papers devoted to the insurance companies, which threatened to raise their premiums, were unanimous on this point. The opinion of the public being thus pronounced, the United States took the initiative. Preparations were made at New York for an expedition destined to pursue this narwhal. A frigate of great speed, the Abraham Lincoln, was fitted out for sea at once. Commodore Farragut pushed forwards the armaments of the ship rapidly. After this very time, as always happens, when they had determined to pursue the monster did not turn up. For 2 months nothing was heard about it. No vessel had fallen in with it. It seemed as if this unicorn had some knowledge of the toils being spread around it. Too much had been said about it, and by means of the Atlantic cable, too. So argued the funny ones, who maintained that this sly dog had intercepted some telegrams, which he had turned to his own advantage. So there was the frigate supplied with material for a lengthened cruise, and formidable apparatus of the monster's capture, and no one knew whether they must sail. The general impatience was increased when, on the 2nd of July, it was announced that a steamer of the San Francisco and China line had seen the animal 3 weeks before in the South Pacific Ocean. The excitement caused by this intelligence was intense. Commodore Farragut had not 24 hours' notice. His provisions were put on board. The bunkers were filled with coal. Not a man of the crew was missing. He had only to light the fires, get up steam, and put to sea. People would not have tolerated the delay of half a day. Besides, Commodore Farragut was only too anxious to set out. 3 hours after the departure of the Abraham Lincoln, we received a letter couched in the following terms. Monsieur Anarax, Professor of the Museum of Paris, 5th Avenue Hotel, New York. Sir, if you wish to accompany the expedition on board the Abraham Lincoln, the United States government will be pleased that France should be represented by you in this expertise. Commodore Farragut will hold a cabin at your disposal. Yours very truly, J.B. Hobson, Secretary of the Admiralty. It is pretty good, yeah. Taking a quick break between chapters. The first chapter was a little technical, but I'm hoping that I'm giving it enough tension and personality to go through all the technicalities. Let's see, my favorite book genre. I was, for quite a while, mainly just fantasy. But since I started working at the bookstore about 16 years ago, I started branching out a little. I do love a good mystery if it's like an intriguing premise. I do love a good intriguing premise. I've read a couple of biographies lately, like the one Anna Kendrick wrote was a lot of fun. It's called Scrappy Little Nobody, and she is just such a personality. And then I read this really fabulous nonfiction called Wild Trees, which was about the coastal redwoods and the people who study them. And it sounds kind of boring, but it's like super not boring. It's by the guy who wrote Hot Zones, so he really knows how to keep your attention. I mean, of course, I still love fantasy, but I've definitely branched out a little bit. And there are a few. I like the spooky horror books. Like, I can't wait until I'll be able to read on the stream A House on Haunted Hill by Shirley Jackson, who was kind of seen as the mother of modern horror. And she does more like ghosty, spooky, as opposed to the gore horror. I don't like the gore horror. Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place with what I like. But probably, I think, intriguing mysteries. How about you? What's your favorite genre?
PP Phantom, post status, Mikey
Oh, hang on a second. I forgot to mute that. There we go.
So you probably heard a little bit of enthusiasm. Amy, she's wonderful. Well, while you're typing your answer, I'm going to go ahead and start Chapter 3. So Chapter 3, Just as Monsieur Pleases. 3 seconds before the arrival of Mr. Hobson's letter, I had no more notion of going in search of the unicorn than of attempting the Northwest Passage. Oh, okay. I was just I was answering your question about what my favorite genre is. And I kind of, I'm all around the place. I started out being mainly just fantasy, but I started branching out, reading some biographies, mysteries, and nonfiction, general fiction, a little bit of horror, but like the spooky, ghosty horror as opposed to I can't think of the word. As opposed to the gore horror. I don't like the gore horror. And I was asking what your favorite genre of book is. So while you type your answer, I am going to continue with Chapter 3. And I just barely started Chapter 3. Chapter 3, Just as Monsieur Pleases. 3 seconds before the arrival of Mr. Hobson's letter, I had no more notion of going in search of the unicorn than of attempting the Northwest Passage. 3 seconds after I had read the secretary's letter, I quite believed that my true vocation, my only aim in life, was to hunt up this monster and rid the world of him. Meanwhile, I was about to undertake a trying journey, with all its fatigue and absence of repose. I had been wishing above everything to see my native land, my friends, my little house in the Jardin des Plantes, my cherished and valuable collections once again. But now nothing would stop me. I forgot all this, friends, collections, and perils, and I accepted without hesitation the offer of the American government. Moreover, I thought every track leads to Europe, and the unicorn may be amiable enough to lead me to the coast of France. This worthy animal would doubtless permit himself to be taken in European waters, for my especial benefit, and I did not wish to bring back less than half a meter of his ivory halberd for the Museum of Natural History. But meantime, it was necessary to search for this narwhal in the North Pacific Ocean, so to reach France, I should probably have to go by way of the Antipodes. Conseil, I cried peremptorily. Conseil was my servant, a devoted fellow who accompanied me in all my wanderings, a brave Fleming whom I like very much and who serves me well. Phlegmatic by nature, regular on principle, zealous from habit, and taking life very easy, very handy, and apt in all things, and, his name notwithstanding, never giving advice, even when he was not asked to. In consequence of associating with savants in our little world in the Jardin des Plantes, Conseil had picked up some information. I possessed in him a specialist, well up in the classification of natural history, who could run, so to speak, like an acrobat up the ladder of branches, groups, classes, subclasses, orders, families, genus, subgenus, species, and varieties. But there his scientific attainments stopped. To class with his Ultima Thule, but he knew nothing beyond that. Completely versed in the theory of classification, but little in the practice, I do not believe he could distinguish a cachalot from a whale. Nevertheless, he was a brave and worthy fellow. For the last 10 years, Conseil had followed me whithersoever science had drawn me. He never commented upon either the duration of the fatigue or of a journey. He had no objection to start for any country, China or Congo. It was all the same to him. He could go to one or the other and ask no questions. Moreover, he enjoyed excellent health, which set all illness as defiance.
Solid muscles, no nerves, not even the appearance of nerves. I mean moral nerves, of course. He was 30 years of age, and his age was to his masters as 15 to 20. So I need not add that I was 40 years old. Oh, my age. The Conseil had one fault. A strict formalist, he never addressed me except in the third person, enough to set your teeth on edge. Conseil, I repeated, as I began, with feverish hands, to make preparations for departure. Certainly I was sure of this devoted fellow. In ordinary circumstances I never asked him whether it would suit him or not to accompany me in my travels, but this time it was upon an expedition which might be indefinitely prolonged and hazardous, in the pursuit of an animal capable of crunching a frigate like a nutshell. There was indeed a reflection in this, even for the most impassible man in the world. What would Conseil say? "Conseil!" I cried for the third time. Conseil appeared. "Did monsieur call?" he asked as he entered. "Yes, my lad, get my things and your own ready. We start in 2 hours." "Just as monsieur pleases," replied Conseil calmly. "There is not an instant to lose. Pack up my trunk quickly." "And monsieur's collections?" asked Conseil. "We will see about those later." "Wait! The Archaeotherium, the Hypocortherium, the Oreodons, the Cheropotamus, the other specimens. The hotel people will take care of them. And the Barbarossa? They will keep it during our absence. Besides, I will leave orders to forward our menagerie to France." "You are not returning to Paris, then?" said Conseil. "Well, yes, certainly," I replied evasively, "but we shall take a little round." "Any detour that monsieur pleases?" "Oh, that will not be of much consequence, but a less direct route, that's all. We shall sail in the Abraham Lincoln." "As may be most convenient to monsieur," replied Conseil quickly. "You are aware, my friend, of the question about this monster, this narwhal? We are about to purge the sea of him. The author of a work in quarto and in 2 volumes upon the mysteries of the great ocean depths cannot give up the idea of embarking with Commodore Farragut. A glorious enterprise, but dangerous. One cannot tell where they may go. These animals are very capricious, but I shall go all the same. We have a commander who has no fear." "If monsieur goes, I will go," replied Conseil. "But mark well, for I have no wish to hide anything. This is one of the journeys from which one cannot always return." "Just as monsieur pleases." A quarter of an hour afterwards, our trunks were ready. Conseil had done everything, and I was sure nothing was forgotten, for this fellow could classify shirts and coats as well as birds and beasts. The hotel lift deposited us in the great vestibule of the entresol. I descended to the hall, paid my bill, and gave directions to have my various collections of plants and animals forwarded to Paris. I opened a credit for the Barbarossa, and, followed by Conseil, jumped into a carriage. The fly at 20 francs the course. Descended Broadway as far as Union Square, proceeded along 4th Avenue to its junction with Bowery Street, entered Catherine Street, and stopped at the 34th Pier. There the Catherine ferry took us all over, men, horses, and carriage, to Brooklyn, the great suburb of New York, situated upon the left bank of the river, and in a few moments we reached the quay, close to which the Abraham Lincoln was vomiting huge volumes of black smoke from her 2 funnels. Our baggage was immediately put on board. I hurried after it, and asked to see the Commodore. One of the sailors conducted me up to the poop, where I found myself in the presence of an officer of pleasant appearance, who offered me his hand. "Monsieur Pierre Anorax?" said he. "The same," said I. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Commodore Farragut?" "Yes, in person. You are welcome, sir, and your cabin is prepared." I saluted him, and leaving the Commodore to his duties, I descended to the cabin destined for my reception. The Abraham Lincoln had been well selected and fitted out for its novel enterprise. She was a quick sailor, fitted with superheating apparatus which permitted the expansion of the steam to 7 atmospheres. With such a pressure, the Abraham Lincoln attained an average speed of 18 miles and a quarter an hour. A very considerable speed, too, but not sufficient to cope with a gigantic cetacean. The interior arrangements of the frigate were in keeping with her sea-going qualities. I was much pleased with my cabin, situated at the stern, opening to the wardroom. "We shall be very comfortable here," said I to Conseil. "Very much so indeed, if monsieur is not displeased to live like a hermit crab in a whelk shell." I left Conseil to arrange the cabin and descended to the deck to investigate the preparations for getting under way. At this moment, Commodore Farragut gave orders to let go. So, and had I been a quarter of an hour later, I should have been left behind, and missed this extraordinary and improbable expedition, for which this truthful narrative may perhaps contain some incredible statements. But Commodore Farragut did not wish to lose an hour in searching the seas in which the animal was reported to be found. He sent for the engineer. "Is steam up?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied the engineer. "Go ahead, then," said the Commodore. At this order, which was conveyed to the engine-room by a speaking tube, the engineers started the engines. The steam hissed into the cylinders. The long pistons sent the connecting rods of the shaft in motion. The blades of the screw beat the waves with increasing rapidity, and the Abraham Lincoln advanced majestically in the midst of a crowd of ferry boats and tenders filled with spectators, which composed the procession. The quays of New York and Brooklyn, bordering the East River, were crowded with the curious. 3 cheers were given by 500,000 throats. Thousands of handkerchiefs were waved in salute to the frigate until she reached the Hudson at the point of the long peninsula in which stands the town of New York. The frigate, coasting the New Jersey side, on which so many pleasant villas were erected, passed the forts which saluted. The Abraham Lincoln replied, dipping and hoisting the American flag 3 times, whose 39 states shone at the peak, and slackened speed so as to make the buoyed channel which leads into the inner bay, formed by the point of Sandy Hook, where many thousands of spectators gave the frigate a parting cheer. The procession of boats still followed the Abraham Lincoln, and did not quit her until they reached the lightship of the entrance of the channel. It was then 3 o'clock. The pilot got into his boat and was pulled on board like his little schooner, which lay hove to, awaiting him. The frigate's fires were coaled up. The screw revolved quicker than before. The frigate passed the yellow low coast of Long Island, and at 8 o'clock p.m., having lost sight of Fire Island, she proceeded at full speed across the Atlantic. Taking a little break between chapters. Oh, steampunk horror, so this might fit in with that. Also, I'd say look up The Time Machine and Journey to the Center of the Earth. Pretty much any Jules Verne's or H.G. Wells. They were kind of the fathers of the genre. Science fiction and steampunk. Chapter 4. Ned Land. Commodore Farragut was a good sailor and worthy of the frigate he commanded. His ship and he were gone. He was the soul of it. On the question of cetaceans, he entertained no doubt. He would not permit any discussion respecting it. He believed in it as some good women believe in the Leviathan, or faith, not by reason. The monster was in existence, and he had sworn to rid the sea of him. He was a sort of Knight of Rhodes, a Dieudonné de Gozon, marching to encounter the serpent that was devastating this island. Either Farragut must kill the narwhal, or the narwhal would kill Farragut. There was no compromising the matter. The officers were of the same opinion as their commander. One would hear them speak, discuss, dispute, and calculate the various chances of an encounter as they scanned the ocean expanse. More than one imposed a voluntary watch upon himself and descended to the fore topmast cross trees, which, under other circumstances, would have been voted an awful bore. So soon as the sun got hot, the masts were ascended by sailors, to whose feet the planks of the deck were too warm. Meanwhile, the Abraham Lincoln had not yet entered upon the suspected waters of the Pacific. As for the ship's company, they asked for nothing better than a meeting with the Unicorn, to harpoon him, hoist him on board, and to cut him up. They watched the sea with scrupulous attention. Moreover, Commodore Farragut had spoken of a certain sum of $2,000, reserved for whosoever he be, shipboy or able seaman, master or officers, who should first signal the animal. By the way, $2,000 in that time was an insane amount. So I leave you to imagine whether they used their eyes on board the Abraham Lincoln. For my own part, I was not behindhand with the others, and delegated to no one my part of the daily observations. The frigate might, with much reason, have been called Argus. Only amongst them all Conseil protested by his indifference on the question, which absorbed us, and was somewhat a damper of the general enthusiasm on board. I have already mentioned that Commodore Farragut had carefully provided proper apparatus to catch this enormous cetacean. A whaling ship could not have been better armed. We possessed all known weapons, from the simple hand harpoon to the barbed arrows fired from a blunderbuss and the explosive bullets of the deck gun. On the forecastle was trained the latest pattern of breech-loading cannon, of great thickness and accuracy, the model of which was in the exhibition of 1867. This valuable weapon of American construction could carry with ease a conical shot weighing 4 kilograms to a distance of 16 kilometers. Thus no means of destruction were wanting on board the frigate. But there was better than this still. There was Ned Land, the king of harpooners. Ned Land was a Canadian of almost incredible sleight of hand and unrivaled in his perilous profession. Skill and coolness, bravery and tact he possessed in a very high degree, and it must indeed be a very malignant whale or a very astute cachalot that could escape from his harpoon. Ned Land was about 40. He was of great frame and over 6 feet high, strongly built, grave, silent, sometimes passionate, and very angry when contradicted. He attracted attention by his appearance, and chiefly by the steadiness of his gaze, which gave a singular expressiveness to his countenance. I believe that Commodore Farragut had wisely engaged this man. He was worth the whole crew for steadiness of eye and hand. I can only compare him to a powerful telescope, which could be immediately used as a loaded cannon. A Canadian is a Frenchman, and little communicative as Ned Land was, I think he conceived a certain liking for me. My nationality attracted him, no doubt. It was an opportunity for him to speak, and for me to listen to the old language of Rabelais, which is still in use in some parts of Canada. The family of the harpooners were originally from Quebec, and had already grown into a tribe of hardy fishermen when that town belonged to France. By degrees, Ned got to like a chat, and I was glad to hear the recitals of his adventures in the Arctic Sea. He recounted his fishing exploits and his combats with much natural poetry of expression. His narratives assumed the epic form, and I could fancy I was listening to some Canadian Homer chanting an Iliad of the Arctic regions. I am now describing his handy companion as I actually knew him. We have become quite old friends, reunited by the unalterable band of friendship which is born of and cemented by the most terrible experiences in common. Ah, brave Ned, I only ask to live 100 years so as to think the longer of you. And now what was Ned Land's opinion respecting this marine monster? I should state that he scarcely credited the unicorn theory, and was the only one on board who did not share in the general conviction. He even avoided the subject, upon which I thought he ought to have entered some day. One lovely evening, the 30th July, that is to say, 3 weeks after our departure, the frigate was about 30 miles to windward of Cape Blanco and on the coast of Patagonia. We had passed the Tropic of Capricorn, and the Straits of Magellan were scarcely 700 miles to the south. Before 8 days had passed, the Abraham Lincoln would be plowing the water of the Pacific. Sitting on the poop, Ned Land and I were chanting of various things, watching that mysterious sea whose depths are still inaccessible to human research. I led the conversation up to the subject of the gigantic unicorn, and treated of the chances of success or failure of our expedition. Then, perceiving that Ned permitted me to speak without replying, I put the direct question. How is it, Ned, that you cannot be convinced of the existence of this cetacean as we are pursuing? Have you any particular reasons for being so incredulous? The harpooner looked at me for some seconds before he replied, then striking his forehead with a gesture habitual to him and closing his eyes as if to collect his thoughts, he said at last, "Perhaps I have, Monsieur Honorax." "Why, Ned, a man like you, a whaler by profession, and familiar as you are with all these such marine animals, you, whose imagination can easily entertain the hypothesis of a Norman cetacean, you ought to be the very last person to harbor a doubt under such circumstances." "It's just there where you make the mistake, sir," replied Ned. "That common people may believe in wonderful comets, or in the existence of antediluvian monsters inhabiting the center of the earth. It's not surprising, but neither the astronomer nor the geologist will admit such a theory. In the same way, the whaler. I have hunted hundreds of cetaceans, harpooned quantities of them, killed them by the dozen, but powerful and armed as they were, neither their tails nor their tusks were able to pierce or damage the hull of any iron steamer." "But, Ned, there have been cases in which the tooth of the narwhal has pierced ships through." "Wooden ships, perhaps," replied the Canadian. "All the same, I've never seen any. But on the contrary, I deny that whales, cachalots, or narwhals can produce such an effect." "Just listen to me, Ned." "No, sir, no. Anything you like except that. A gigantic polypus, for instance." "Still less. The polypus is only a mollusk, and the name of it even indicates the consistency of its flesh. Is it 500 feet long ever? Why, the polypus does not belong to the branch of vertebrates, and it is perfectly harmless towards such vessels as the Scotia and the Abraham Lincoln. We may then relegate to the land of fables all tales of the exploits of krakens and other monsters of the like nature." "Then, sir," said Ned, in a bantering tone, "you admit the existence of an enormous cetacean?" "Yes, Ned. I repeat it with a conviction founded upon the logic of facts. I believe in the existence of a mammifer of a powerful organization belonging to the vertebrate families, like whales, cachalots, and dolphins, and furnished with a horny defense whose power of penetration is very great." Replied the harpooner, nodding his head with the air of a man unwilling to be convinced. "Just consider, my worthy Canadian," I replied, "that if such an animal exists, if it inhabits the depths of the ocean, if it lives some miles below the surface, it necessarily possesses an organism defying all comparison." "And why should it have such a powerful organism?" "Because it must possess a tremulous strength to enable it to live as because it must possess a tremendous strength to enable it to live so far below the surface and resist the pressure of the water. Really? Replied Ned with a wink. Certainly, and figures can easily demonstrate it. Oh, figures! Cried Ned. One can do anything with figures. In business, Ned, but not in mathematics. Listen. Granting that the pressure of the atmosphere may be represented by the pressure of a column of water 32 feet high, in reality the column of water would be of less height, since it would be seawater, whose density is superior to that of fresh water. Well, when you dive, Ned, so long as you have 32 feet of water above you, your body is supporting a pressure equal to that of the atmosphere, that is to say, a kilogram for each square centimeter of surface. It follows that at 320 feet, this pressure would be equal to 10 atmospheres, and to 100 atmospheres at 3,200 feet, and 1,000 atmospheres is 32,000 feet, which is about 2.5 leagues. This is equivalent to saying that if you could reach this depth, each square centimeter of your body would bear a pressure of 1,000 kilograms. Now, my brave Ned, do you know how many square centimeters of surface there are in your body? I cannot tell, Monsieur Anorax. About 17,000. So many as that? And as, in fact, the atmospheric pressure is a little greater than 1 kilogram to a square centimeter, your 17,000 square centimeters are at this moment supporting a pressure of 17,568 kilograms, 97,500 pounds. Without my being sensible of it, without your being sensible of it, and if you are not crushed by this pressure, it is because the air enters your body with an equal force, so the inward and outward pressure are equal. They neutralize each other, and if you can support it without inconvenience. But in the water it is a different thing. Yes, I understand, replied Ned, who was now very attentive, because the water surrounds me and does not enter the body. Precisely, Ned. So, at 32 feet below the surface of the sea, you would be subject to a pressure of 17,568 kilograms. At 320 feet, 10 times that pressure, that is to say, 175,680 kilograms. At 3,200 feet, 100 times that pressure, 1,756,800 kilograms. At 32,000 feet, at least 1,000 times that pressure, 17,568,000 kilograms. In other words, you would be flattened out as if you had been under a hydraulic press. The devil! Exclaimed Ned. So, my worthy harpooner, if vertebrates, many 100 meters long and large in proportion, live at such depths, and whose surface is represented by millions of centimeters, we must estimate the pressure to which they are subject by thousands of millions of kilograms. Calculate now what the strength of their bony structure and organism must be to enable them to resist such pressure. They must be like ironclad frigates, replied Ned. Just so, Ned. And now think of the damage such a mass could do if, going to express speed, it encounters the hull of a ship. Well, yes, perhaps, replied the Canadian, staggered by these figures, but unwilling to yield to them. Well, are you convinced? You have convinced me of one thing, sir, and that is that if such animals live at the bottom of the sea, they must necessarily be as strong as you state. But if they do not exist, how can you explain the accident to the Scotia? Perhaps, replied Ned. Well, go on. Because it is not true, replied the Canadian, imitating unconsciously a celebrated reply of Arago. But this reply only proved the harpooner's obstinacy, nothing more. I said no more upon that occasion. The accident to the Scotia was undeniable. The hole existed, and it had to be stopped up. and I do not think that the existence of any hole could be more conclusively demonstrated. Now, as the hole did not get there of its own accord, and since it had not been produced by rocks or submarine engines, it must have been caused by some animal. Now, according to my view, as for reasons already given, this animal belonged to the vertebrate branch, class Mammalia, group Pisciform, and to the order of Cetacea. It was of the whale family, or of the cachalots or dolphins. Its genus and species was a matter for later discussion. To decide this, it must be dissected. To dissect it, it must first be caught. To catch it, we must have the harpooner. That was Ned Land's business. The harpooner must see it, which was the ship's affair, and to see it, it must first be in sight, which was a matter of chance. We reached the end of the chapter, taking a small break. Ooh, if you can take a picture of your gear, that would be really awesome. Definitely put it up on the Discord. Oh, and thank you for posting up your link in the self-promo. Ooh, nice. I do love the aesthetic of Fallout. It's kind of like, it's not steampunk, but it is kind of that genre. It's futuristic, but it's harkening back to an older day, I guess you could say. Really interesting. As for my least favorite genre, I admit that my least favorite to sell is politics. Not because, like, it's a bad subject, but it can be done in a bad way. Like, of course, it is important to think about issues, but so often it gets turned into like a schoolyard. Like, they're calling each other names and all of that, and it's just very frustrating. Oh, nice. Awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do. I saw just a tiny bit, but I couldn't see more than that. I was getting ready to cook dinner at the time. Yeah. And it's frustrating because, these sorts of things have turned it into a thing that people want to avoid. But we really should, pay attention to stuff, learn stuff, think about this stuff. But not in the schoolyard bully kind of way that it has been turning into. So yeah, it has the potential to be good, but more often the attention gets put on the bad, and that turns people off of it, and we get stuck into ruts and stuff like that. Bad things happen because people are ignoring stuff. All right, continuing. Chapter 5, Adventure. The voyage of the Abraham Lincoln was not marked by any particular incident for some time. Nevertheless, a circumstance occurred which brought out the wonderful skill of Ned Land and showed what confidence might be reposed in him. On 30th June, the frigate communicated with some American whalers, and we learnt that they had seen nothing of the narwhal. But the captain of one vessel, the Monroe, hearing that Ned Land was on board the Abraham Lincoln, asked for his assistance in chasing a whale then in sight. The Commodore, wishing to see Ned Land at work, gave him leave to go on board the Monroe. Chance favored the Canadian, who, instead of one whale, harpooned 2, right and left, striking one to the heart and taking possession of the other after a chase of some minutes. Certainly, if the monster should ever come into contact with Ned Land, it would be very bad for the monster. The frigate ran along the southeast coast of America at a rapid rate. On the 3rd July, we opened up the Straits of Magellan near Virgin Cape. But the Commodore did not wish to enter upon this winding passage, so we directed our course round Cape Horn. The crew thought him right. Was it all at all likely that the narwhal would be encountered in this sinuous strait? A number of the sailors declared that the monster was too big to pass it. Upon the afternoon of July 6th, the Abraham Lincoln doubled the solitary island, that isolated rock at the extremity of the American continent, named Horn by the Dutch sailors who discovered it, in compliment to their native town. The course now lay northwest, and next day the frigate's screw beat the waves of the Pacific Ocean. "Keep your eyes open now," cried the sailors to each other, and they did very considerably. Eyes and telescopes, somewhat dazzled, it is true, by the prospect of $2,000, rested not a minute. Day and night the ocean was scanned, and those who had night glasses, whose faculties of seeing increased their opportunities 50%, had a good chance of gaining the reward. For myself, though the money was no attraction, I was not the least attentive for those on board. Giving but a few minutes to meals or repose, careless of the sun or wind, I scarcely quitted the deck. Sometimes perched in the nettings on the forecastle, sometimes on the poop rail, I watched with anxious eyes the creamy wake of the frigate. And often have I partaken of the emotions of the officers and crew, when some capricious whale elevated his black back above the surface of the waves. The deck of the frigate was crowned in an instant. Officers and men came tumbling up from below, panting for breath, with restless eyes watching the course of the cetacean. I looked also, and became nearly blind over it, while Conseil, always so phlegmatic, would say calmly, "If monsieur would have the goodness to open his eyes a little less widely, he would see very much better." But all this excitement was to no purpose. The Abraham Lincoln would change her course and approach the animal signaled by the time, a whale or cachalot, which soon disappeared in the midst of the volley of curses. Meantime, the weather continued favorable, and the voyage was proceeding under pleasant circumstances. It was then the winter season, for July in those latitudes corresponded to our January in Europe, but the sea remained calm, and could be observed for miles in every direction. Ned Land still remained incredulous. He would not even pretend to examine the sea, save during his watch, except when a whale turned up, and nevertheless his wide range of vision would have rendered great service. But 8 hours out of 12 this particular fellow was either reading or sleeping in his cabin. 100 times I have expostulated with him. "Bah," he would reply, "there's nothing at all, Monsieur Anorax, and if there were some animal what chance have we of seeing it? Are we not cruising at random? People have, they say, seen this now invisible beast in the Pacific. I admit it, but 2 months have passed since then, and your narwhal does not care to remain long in the same neighborhood. It is gifted with great speed. Now you know as well as I, monsieur, that nature would not have bestowed this attribute of speed upon the animal, were it not for some useful purpose. So if the beast exists, he is far away from here by this time." I had no reply to this. Evidently we are groping in the dark, but how else were we to proceed? So our chances of success were limited. However, no one despaired of ultimate success, and not a sailor on board had bet against the narwhal in his next appearance. We crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 105 degrees of longitude on the 20th January, and on the 27th of the same month we passed the equator on the 110-degree meridian. The frigate now directed her course toward the west, into the center of the Pacific. Commodore Farragut thought, and with reason, that the monster would most likely frequent the depth waters at a distance from any land which it feared to approach, without doubt because there was not sufficient water for it, as the master remarked. The frigate passed by the Marquesas and the Sandwich Islands, crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 132 longitude, and sailed towards the China Seas. We had at last reached the scene of the monster's latest gambols, and as a matter of fact, we lived for nothing else. Our hearts palpitated fearfully and laid the foundation of future aneurysm. The whole ship's company were suffering from a nervous excitement of which I can give no idea. No one ate, no one slept. 20 times a day a mistake or an optical delusion of some sailor perched upon the yards gave rise to intolerable startlings and emotions, 20 times repeated, which kept us in a state of jumpiness, too violent not to bring upon us a reaction at no distant date. And the reaction did not fail to set in. For 3 months of which every day seemed a century, the Abraham Lincoln traversed the South Pacific, running up when a whale was signaled, making sudden turns, going first on one track, then on the other, stopping suddenly, backing and filling, or reversing and going ahead, in a manner calculated to put the engine altogether out of gear, and thus did not leave a point unexplored on the American side of the Japanese coast. And nothing after all was to be seen but the watery waste. No sign of a gigantic narwhal, nor a moving rock, nor of anything at all out of the ordinary. The reaction came. Discouragement seized upon all, and incredulity began to appear. A new feeling arose on board, which was composed of 3/10 shame and 7/10 anger. They all felt very foolish, but were much more annoyed at having been taken in by a chimera. The mountains of argument which had been piled up for a year crumbled away at once, and no one had any thought except to make up for lost time in the matters of food and sleep. With the natural fickleness of the human mind, they went from one extreme to the other. The warmest adherents of the enterprise became, as a matter of course, the most ardent detractors. Reaction set in from the lowest rank to the highest, and certainly, had it not been for the firmness of Commodore Farragut, the frigate's head would have been put to the south again. However, the useless search could not go on forever. The Abraham Lincoln had nothing to reproach itself with. It had done its utmost to ensure success. Never had ship or crew shown more patience or determination. The non-success could not be laid to their charge. Nothing now remained but to return home. A representation to this effect was addressed to the Commodore. He was firm. The sailors did not conceal their disappointment, and the service was suffering accordingly. I do not mean to insinuate that there was a mutiny, but after a reasonable period, Farragut, like another Columbus, determined 3 days more. If during that time the monster did not appear, the helmsman should have orders to put the ship about for American waters. This promise was made upon the 2nd November. The result was to reanimate the failing courage of the crew. The ocean was scanned with fresh zeal. Everyone wished to give a last look in which memory might be summed up. Telescopes were used with a feverish activity. This was the last defiance hurled at the giant narwhal, and he could not in reason decline to reply to the challenge to appear. 2 days had passed. The Abraham Lincoln cruised about at half speed. They employed 1,000 means to awake the attention or to stimulate the apathy of the animal, in the hope that he was in the neighborhood. Enormous quantities of lard were thrown over the stern, and to the great satisfaction of the sharks, I may add. The boats pulled in all directions round the frigate, while she was hove to, and did not leave any part unexplored. But the evenings of the 4th of November arrived, and nothing had been heard of the submarine mystery. On the following day, at noon, the 3 days' grace would expire. After that, Commodore Farragut, faithful to his promise, would give the order to bout ship and abandon the southern Pacific Ocean. The frigate was 31 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 136 degrees 42 east longitude. Japan was 200 miles to windward. Night came on. 8 bells was struck. Heavy clouds veiled the moon. Then, in her first quarter, the sea was calm and rose and fell with a gentle swelling motion. At this time I was forward, leaning on the starboard nettings. Conseil, close to me, was looking ahead. The ship's company, perched in the shrouds, were scanning the horizon, which was darkened and then lightened up occasionally. The officers, with their night glasses, peered into the increasing obscurity. At times the dark sea scintillated under the moon's ray, which darted between the clouds. Then all luminous effects would be again lost in the darkness. Observing Conseil, I fancied that he was yielding to the general influence. Perhaps, and for the first time, his nerves were moved by a sentiment of curiosity. "Well, Conseil," said I, "here's our last opportunity to pocket $2,000. Monsieur must permit me to say that I have never counted upon winning this reward, and the government of the Union might have promised $100,000 without being any the poorer." "You are right, Conseil. This is a foolish business, after all, and into which we rushed too hurriedly. What time has been lost? What useless worry! We might have been in France 6 months ago." "In Monsieur's little apartment," replied Conseil, "in the museum, and I should have already classified the fossils, and the Barbusa would have been installed in its cage in the Jardin des Plantes, and been visited by all the curious people of Paris." "Just so, Conseil, and no doubt they were all laughing at us." "In reality," replied Conseil quietly, "I think that they do laugh at us, monsieur, and may I say it? You may. Well, then, monsieur has only got what he deserves." "Indeed." "When one has the honor to be a savant like monsieur, one does not make oneself conspicuous." But Conseil never finished his compliment. In the midst of the universal silence, a voice was heard. It was Ned Land's voice, and Ned Land cried out, "Halloo there! There is an enemy way on the weather beam."
What's up, Snockings? Hi. Do you want to join me?
Okay, between chapters, reading. Ow, 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 Snockings. Ouch. That was painful. Ooh, nice. I saw somebody was playing one of the Final Fantasies. I don't remember which one, and they were doing a close-up on picklocking in the game. It was interesting. Ooh, nice. Mysterious hero. I love it when my birthday appears in books like that. My birthday hasn't appeared in this book yet. Well, we actually passed through it. They were hunting fruitlessly for it. All right, Chapter 6, Full Speed. At this announcement, the whole crew ran towards the harpooner. Commodore, officers, mates, sailors, and boys. Even the engineers left the engine room, and the stokers the furnaces. The order to stop her was given, and the frigate now only glided through the water by her own momentum. The darkness was profound, and the Canadian must have had very good eyes, and I wondered what he had seen and how he had been able to see it. My heart was beating fast. But Ned Land had not been mistaken, and we all perceived the object he indicated with his outstretched hand. 2 cables' length from the Abraham Lincoln, and on the starboard quarter, the sea appeared to be illuminated from below. It was not a common phosphorescence, and could not be mistaken for it. The monster, some fathoms beneath the surface, gave forth his intense light, which had been referred to in the report of many captains. This wonderful irradiation must have been produced by some tremendously powerful illuminating agent.
The luminous part described an immense elongated oval upon the water, in the center of which was condensed a focus of unbearable brilliancy, which radiated by successive gradations. "It is nothing but an agglomeration of phosphorescent molecules," cried one of the officers. "No, sir," I replied firmly. "Neither the folates nor salpae produce such a powerful light. This brilliancy is essentially electric. But look! Look! It moves, it advances, it retreats, it is rushing towards us!" A general cry arose. "Silence!" cried Farragut. "Put the helm up. Hard! Turn astern!" The sailors rushed to the wheel, the engineers of the engine room. The engine was reversed, and the Abraham Lincoln paid off to larboard and described a semicircle. "Steady! Go ahead!" replied Commodore Farragut. These orders were executed, and the frigate rapidly distanced the luminous object. I should have said attempted to distance it, for the supernatural animal moved with twice the speed of the frigate. We were speechless. Astonishment more than fear kept us silent and motionless. The animal gained upon us easily. He swam round the frigate, which was then going 14 knots, and wrapped us in its electric beams like a luminous dust. He then went away for 2 or 3 miles, leaving a phosphorescent line behind him, like the volumes of steam left by the engines of an express train. All at once, from the dark limit of the horizon, where he had gone to take his start, the monster launched himself suddenly against the Abraham Lincoln with fearful rapidity, stopped suddenly within 20 paces of the frigate, extinguished the light, not by plunging beneath the surface, since the gleam was not withdrawn by degrees, but suddenly, as if the source of the brilliant light had been suddenly dried up. It then reappeared at the other side of the frigate, so either it had turned, or the monster gone underneath it. At every moment a collision seemed imminent, and that would have been fatal to us. Meantime, I wondered at the behavior of the frigate. She was flying and not attacking. She was pursued instead of being the pursuer, and I said so to Commodore Farragut. His usually impassible face betrayed the greatest astonishment. "Monsieur Anorax," he replied, "I do not know with what formidable being I have to do. I do not wish to risk my ship in this darkness. Besides, how can I attack it, or how defend myself from its attack? Let us wait for daylight, and the sides will be changed. You have no doubt respecting the nature of the animal, Commodore." "No, it is evidently a gigantic narwhal, but also an electric one." "Perhaps," I replied, "we do not approach it any more than a torpedo. Or perhaps we should not approach it any more than a torpedo." "Quite so," replied the Commodore, "and if it possesses the power to emit a shock, it is the most terrible animal ever created. That is why, sir, I am on my guard." The crew all remained on deck during the night. No one dared to sleep. The Abraham Lincoln, not being able to cope with the animal in speed, had moderated her pace and was kept under easy steam. On his part, the narwhal imitated the frigate, lay rocking at the will of the waves, and appeared to have made up its mind not to abandon the struggle. It disappeared, however, about midnight, or, to employ a better term, extinguished itself like an enormous glowworm. Had it fled? We might fear, but could not hope so. But at 7 minutes to 1 a.m., a deafening rushing sound was heard, like that produced by a column of water expelled with extreme violence. Commodore Farragut, Ned Land, and I were on the poop, searching for its profound obscurity. "Ned Land," asked the Commodore, "you have often heard the blowing of whales?" "Often, sir, but never of such whales, the sight of which has brought me $2,000. "You have a right to the reward. But tell me, is this noise the same as whales make in ejecting water from their blowholes?" "The same noise, sir, but ever so much louder. One cannot mistake it. It is surely a cetacean which is here with us. With your permission, added the harpooner, we will have a word or two with him tomorrow morning. If it will listen to you, Master Land, I said in a skeptical tone. If I get within 4 harpoons' length of him, replied the Canadian, I will engage that he will listen to me. But to approach him, I must put a whaleboat at your disposal, said the Commodore. Certainly, sir. And by so doing risk the lives of my men? And mine too, replied Land quietly. About 2 o'clock a.m. the luminosity reappeared, not less intense, 5 miles to windward of the frigate. Despite the distance of the noise of the wind and waves, the sound made by the formidable beatings of the monster's tail could be distinctly heard, and even its hoarse respiration could be distinguished. It seemed that when this immense narwhal was breathing, that the air rushed from the lungs was like the steam of the cylinders of an engine of 2,000 horsepower. I muttered. A whale with the force of a regiment of cavalry ought to be a fine one. Everyone remained on the watch till daybreak and prepared for the combat. The fishing material was arranged along the nettings. The mate had charge of those blunderbusses which can throw a harpoon to the distance of a mile, and the long duck guns with the explosive bullets, whose wound is mortal, even with the most powerful animals. Ned Land was content with his harpoon, which in his hands was a terrible weapon. At 6 o'clock day began to dawn, and at the first beams of sunrise the narwhal's light was extinguished. At 7 o'clock the light was sufficiently strong for our purpose, but a very thick mist hung around the horizon, and the best glasses could not pierce it. Much disappointment and anger was the result. I ascended to the mizzen-yard. Several officers were already perched in the masthead. At 8 o'clock the mist began to disperse slowly. The horizon gradually cleared. Suddenly the voice of Ned Land was heard. "Here's the animal astern!" Everyone looked in the direction indicated. There, about a mile and a half from the frigate, a long black body appeared itself about a yard above the waves. Its tail, which moved quickly, kept up a considerable agitation in the water. Never had tail beaten the water with such force. An immense frothy wake marked the course of the animal, and described an extended curve. The frigate approached the cetacean. I examined it carefully. The reports of the Shannon and Helvetica had exaggerated its dimensions a little, and I estimated its length at only 250 feet. As for its bulk, it could not have easily arrived at, but the animal appeared to me to be admirably proportioned throughout. While I was looking at its phenomenal creature, 2 jets of water and steam spurted from the blowholes, up to a height of 40 yards, which sent its manner of respiration in my mind. From that I concluded that the animal belonged to the vertebrates, class Mammifer, subclass Monodolphins, Pisciform group, Cetacean order, and family. Here I was unable to pronounce an opinion. The cetaceans comprise 3 families: whales, cachalots, and dolphins, and it is with the last named that narwhals are ranged. Each of these families is divided into several genus, each genus into species, each species into varieties. Variety, species, genus, and families fail me here, but I do not doubt that I should be able to complete my classification with the assistance of Heaven and Commodore Farragut. The crew were impatiently awaiting orders. The Commodore, having attentively observed the animal, called the engineer. He came at once. "Have you plenty of steam?" "Yes, sir," replied the engineer. "Good. Fire up, and go ahead full speed." 3 cheers accompanied this order. The struggle had come, and a few moments after the frigate's chimneys poured forth their black smoke, and the deck shook with the action of the engines. The Abraham Lincoln, impelled by her powerful screw, went for the strange animal direct. It permitted the frigate to approach to within half a cable's length, then, disdaining to dive, went on a little, and contented itself by keeping its distance. This manner of pursuit continued for about 3/4 of an hour, without the frigate having gained upon the cetacean. It became evident that if we kept thus, we should never reach it. Commodore Farragut got very angry. "Ned Land!" he cried. The Canadian approached him. "Well, Master Land, you still advise me to launch a boat?" "No, sir," replied Ned Land. "This beast will not let you take him unless he pleases." "What are we to do, then?" "Keep up the highest possible pressure, and, if you will permit it, I will get under the bowsprit, and if I come within casting distance, I will harpoon him." "Go, Ned," replied the Commodore. "Go ahead faster," he cried to the engineer. Ned Land took up his position. The furnaces were coaled up. The screw made 43 revolutions in the minute, and the steam went roaring through the safety valves. They heaved along, and found that the frigate was going at a rate of 18.5 miles an hour. But the cursed animal also went at 18.5 miles an hour. For an hour and a half the frigate went at his pace, without gaining a foot. This was rather humiliating for one of the swiftest vessels of the American Navy. The ship's company got sulky. They reviled the monster, which did not condescend to reply. Commodore Farragut no longer twisted his chin tuft. He bit it. The engineer was summoned once more. "Are you going at your fullest possible pressure?" "Yes, sir," replied the engineer. "The valves are changed?" "Up to 2 atmospheres and a half." "Charge them up to 10, cried the Commodore. That was a true American order. It could not be surpassed on the Mississippi to distance a rival steamer. "Conseil," said I to my faithful servitor, who was near, "do you know where we are likely to go?" "Wherever monsieur pleases," replied Conseil. "Well, I confess I am not indisposed to take the chance," said I. The steam gauge went up. The furnaces were filled. The speed increased. The masts shook fearfully, and the chimneys seemed scarcely sufficient to permit the escape of the immense volumes of smoke. They heaved the log again. "What pace now, eh?" inquired the Commodore. 19 1/4, sir. Press on more." The engineer obeyed. The steam gauge showed 10 atmospheres pressure, but the narwhal had also fired up, for it was now going at 19 1/4 also. What a chase it was! I cannot describe my feelings. Ned Land was at his post, harpoon in hand. Many a time the animal permitted us to approach. We're gaining! Cried the Canadian. But at the moment he was prepared to strike, the cetacean went ahead with a speed of scarcely less than 30 miles an hour. And even at our greatest speed it cruised round the frigate. A cry of fury then escaped from all. At midday we were not more advanced towards the attainment of our object than we had been at 8 o'clock. Commodore Farragut then decided to employ more direct measures. "Well," he said, "that animal can go faster than the Abraham Lincoln. We will see if he can distance a conical bullet. Gunner, get the forward gun ready for action." The bow gun was immediately loaded, pointed, and fired. The ball passed over the cetacean, now half a mile distant. Take better aim next time, you lubbers, and there's $5 to a man who puts a shot into the infernal beast." An old gunner with a gray beard came forward with a determined air and resolute eye. He pointed the gun and took a long, steady aim. A loud detonation was heard amid the cheers of the crew. The shot had hit the animal, but not fairly. It glanced off its smooth side and fell into the sea 2 miles distant. "Ah!" cried the gunner angrily. "Those kind of fellows are sheeted with 6 inches of iron, I suppose." "Tarnation!" cried Commodore Farragut. The chase recommenced, and the Commodore, coming towards me, said, "I will pursue that thing till the frigate blows up." "Yes," I replied, "you are quite right." But I could not but hope that the animal might become exhausted, and not be so indifferent to fatigue as a steam frigate. But it was no use. Time passed without the animal showing any sign of fatigue. But I must confess that the Abraham Lincoln kept up the chase with great spirit. I do not think that we traversed less than 300 miles during that inauspicious 6th of November. Night came and enveloped the swelling ocean in its shadow. I then began to believe that our expedition was at an end, and that we had seen the last of the fantastic monster. But I was mistaken. At 10 p.m. the electric gleam again appeared about 3 miles off, as clear and bright as upon the preceding night. The narwhal was motionless. Perhaps fatigued by its day's run, it was asleep, rocked by the billows. This was a chance by which Farragut determined to profit. He gave orders that the frigate should be put at easy speed and advance cautiously towards its enemies. It was by no means an uncommon occurrence to meet sleeping whales at sea when they have been successfully attacked, and Ned Land had frequently harpooned them under those circumstances. He took up his former position at the bows, while the frigate noiselessly approached the animal and stopped the engines about 2 cables' length distance, merely advancing by its momentum. The crew were in a state of breathless attention. Profound silence reigned on deck. We were not 100 paces from the light which flashed into our eyes. At this moment I saw Ned Land beneath me, holding by one hand to the martingale, with the other brandishing his fatal harpoon. Scarcely 20 paces separated us from the sleeping monster. Suddenly Ned launched the harpoon. I heard the blow with which it hit the prey. It sounded as if it had come in contact with a hard substance. The electric gleam was suddenly extinguished, and 2 enormous columns of water were directed over the deck of the frigate, rushing like a torrent fore and aft, overturning the men and breaking the seizings of the spars. A terrible shock was felt, and thrown over the bulwark before I had time to save myself, I was precipitated into the sea. Let's see. You've seen Nightmare Before Christmas, correct? I did Sally's dress, and I didn't do the, it's not recipe, the pattern. I didn't do the pattern, I just sort of got the kind of fabrics that looked nice and then just sort of put them all together, and yeah, it was fun. I don't still have it, but I do have pictures. I'll post them on my Discord. I do too. I think it has some really great songs. The guy who did the music, Danny Elfman, he did the voice of Jack's singing voice, but he didn't do Jack's talking voice, and he didn't intend for that to happen. He had done little sample tapes for Tim Burton, and when Tim Burton heard them, he's like, "Great, you're Jack." He's like, "But wait, no, somebody else, that other guy's supposed to be Jack." And he's like, "Nope, you're perfect, you're doing it." And that was the same thing for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the Tim Burton version. He had done the sample tapes of that, sent them off to Tim Burton, and those are actually the recordings that were used in... If you listen, Speaking Jack is a bit more mellow, a little more mild, and when he's singing, he has a more pronounced intensity to his voice. And actually, Danny Elfman, before he became a composer for movies, he was in a band, Oingo Boingo. Yeah. Fun stuff. And I actually, a guy that does like some of the orchestral music in some of the plays in our community, he was in one of Danny Elfman's orchestras for one of his movies, and I don't remember which. I know it was, I think, was it an 80s band or a 70s? I think it was a 70s band. They're very, like, funk, I guess they are, like funk rock. I'll try to find one of the songs and I'll post it up. Yeah, I'll post it up on the Discord and the videos, or no, on the music. That's what it is. All right, so I think we have enough time for one more chapter, and then I'm going to switch over to a game stream after a little bit of a break. Chapter 7, because this would be a terrible place to leave the story time. Chapter 7, An Unknown Species of Whale. So surprised was I by my unexpected fall that I have but little recollection of my sensations at the time. I was first dragged down about 20 feet. I am a good swimmer, but not so good as Byron or Edgar Poe, and this plunge did not embarrass me. 2 vigorous strokes brought me to the surface. My first care was to seek the frigate. Had the crew observed my fall? Had the Abraham Lincoln put about? Was the Commodore sending a boat for me? Could I hope to be rescued? The darkness was profound. I could perceive a black mass disappearing in the east, whose lights were extinguished by distance. It was the frigate. I felt I was lost. "Help! Help!" I cried, swimming in the direction of the Abraham Lincoln despairingly. My clothes weighed upon me heavily. The water glued them to my body. They paralyzed my movements. I was dying. I was suffocating. "Help!" This was the last cry I uttered. My mouth filled with water. I was overwhelmed, dragged beneath the surface. Suddenly, my clothes were seized by a strong hand. I was drawn up, and I heard these words: "Monsieur will have the great kindness to support himself upon my shoulder. He will swim more easily." I seized the arm of my faithful Conseil. "Is it you?" I said. "You?" "Myself," replied Conseil, "at Monsieur's orders." "And you were thrown into the sea by that shock as well as I?" "Not at all, but being in Monsieur's service, I have followed him." The worthy fellow saw nothing extraordinary in this. "And the frigate?" I asked. "The frigate?" replied Conseil, turning on his back. "I think we had better not count upon her." "What?" "I say that as I jumped into the sea, I heard the steersman cry, 'The screw and the helm are both broken.'" "Broken?" "Yes, by the teeth of that monster. It is the only damage the Abraham Lincoln has suffered, but unfortunately for us, she cannot steer." "Then we are lost." "Perhaps so," replied Conseil calmly. "But we have still some hours before us, and a great many things may happen in that time." The imperturbable coolness of Conseil reassured me. I swam more vigorously, but, impeded by my clothes, I found great difficulty in keeping afloat. Conseil perceived this. "Will monsieur permit me to take a little incision? There," said he, and with a quick movement he passed the blade of his knife from my back downwards. Then he slowly took off my garments, while I swam for both. I, in my turn, then rendered him a like service, and we continued to swim close together. Nevertheless, the situation was no less alarming. Perhaps our disappearance had not been remarked, and if it had, the frigate would not return for us, being deprived of her rudder. We then could only count upon one of her boats to pick us up. Conseil coolly reasoned upon this hypothesis, and made his arguments accordingly. He was apparently quite at home. We made up our minds that our only chance of safety lay in our rescue by the boats of the frigate, and we therefore ought to arrange so as to remain as long as possible above water. I resolved to divide our strength, and so that we should not succumb simultaneously, and this is how we did it. While one lay upon his back, motionless, with folded arms and extended limbs, the other was to swim and push him along. The part of following in this companion's wake was not to last more than 10 minutes, and by thus taking in turn, we might be able to swim for some hours, and perhaps until dawn. It was but a chance, but hope is firmly anchored in the human breast. Then we were two. In fact, I declare, though it may appear improbable, if I tried to destroy all expectation, if I wished to despair, I could not have done so. The collision between the frigate and the monster had occurred about 11 p.m. I counted about 8 hours swimming until sunrise. This was very practicable by helping each other, as explained. The sea, being smooth, did not trouble us much. Sometimes I tried to pierce the thick darkness, which was broken only by the phosphorescence created by our movements. I kept looking at the luminous waves which broke upon my hand, whose sparkling surface was spotted with bright bubbles. It looked as if we were swimming in a bath of mercury. About 1 o'clock I began to feel very tired. My limbs were knotted with violent cramps. Conseil did his best to support me, and our preservation now depended upon this care. I soon heard the brave fellow gasping for breath, and I understood that he could not hold out much longer. "Let me go," I cried. "Leave me." "Abandon, monsieur, never," he replied. "I am looking forward to drowning before him." At this moment the moon broke through the clouds. The surface of the sea sparkled in its rays. This pleasant light reanimated our courage. I raised my head again and looked around the horizon. I saw the frigate 5 miles away, a black and scarcely distinguishable mass. But there were no boats. I was about to cry out, but for what purpose at such a distance? My swollen lips refused to utter a sound. Conseil could articulate a little, and I heard him repeat many times, "Help! Help!" Suspending our movements for a moment, we listened. Was that a buzzing noise in the air, or was it an answer to Conseil's cry for assistance? "Did you hear that?" I murmured. "Yes, yes," said Conseil again, and Conseil again cried for help despairingly. This time there was no mistake. A human voice replied. Was it the voice of some unfortunate person abandoned in the midst of the ocean? Some other victim in that collision? Or rather, was it a boat from the frigate hailing us in the darkness? Conseil made a last effort, and leaning on my shoulder while I gave all the support of which I was capable, he raised himself half out of the water and fell back exhausted. "What have you seen?" "I have seen," he murmured. "I have seen. But let us not talk. Let us husband all our strength." What had he seen? At that moment the monster came to my mind with all its old force. But there was the voice. The times were past for Jonahs to live in whales' bellies. Nevertheless, Conseil pushed me forward once more. He raised his head at times to look before him, and uttered a cry to which a voice replied nearer and nearer each time. I could scarcely hear it. My strength was spent. My fingers were no longer at my command. My hands could no longer make the strokes. My mouth, convulsively opened, was filled with the salt water, and cold was seizing upon my limbs. I raised my head for the last time and sank. At that moment a hard substance struck me. I clung to it. It drew me upwards, and so soon as I regained the surface I fainted. I came to myself very speedily, thanks to the vigorous friction applied to my body. I opened my eyes. "Conseil," I murmured. "Did monsieur call?" he asked. The moon again burst forth, and by her light I recognized another figure beside Conseil. "Ned!" I exclaimed. "In person, sir, looking after his reward." "You were also thrown into the sea by the collision, I presume?" "Yes, sir," replied he, "but more fortunate than you. I got upon a floating island at once." "An island?" "Yes, or rather upon our gigantic narwhal." "Explain yourself, Ned." "There is only this. I have discovered why my harpoon did not injure the creature, and was blunted by the hide." "Why, Ned, why?" "Because this beast is clothed in sheet iron." It was now necessary for me to recover my spirits and collect my thoughts. The last words of the Canadian had produced a sudden change of thought. I pulled myself up to the top of the object of being upon which we had taken refuge. I kicked it. It was certainly a hard body, and not of the material of which immense marine mammifers are composed. But this hard substance might be a bony covering like those possessed by some antediluvian animals, and I might be free to class it amongst amphibious animals, the tortoises and alligators. But the black surface that supported us was smooth and polished, not imbricated. It gave out a metallic sound when struck, and incredible as it may appear, it seemed to me to be composed of riveted iron plates. No doubt about it, the animal, the monster, the phenomenon which had puzzled the entire scientific world, upset and mystified the minds of sailors in both hemispheres, was a greater wonder still. A phenomenon constructed by human agency. I should not have been nearly so much astonished by the discovery of the most fabulous and mythological of animals. However extraordinary the being may be that is from the hands of the Creator, it can be understood. But to discover all at once, under one's very eyes, the human realization of the impossible was sufficiently startling. But we must not hesitate. Here we were sitting upon the top of a species of submarine boat, which presented, so far as we could judge, the form of an immense fish of iron. This was Ned Land's opinion. Conseil and I could not classify it. "But," said I, "we must contain within him the machinery for locomotion, and a crew to direct this course." "Certainly," replied the Canadian. "Nevertheless, during the 3 hours I have been here, I have perceived no signs of life." "The boat has not moved?" "No, Monsieur Anorax. It has lain rocked by the waves, but has not otherwise moved. We know already that it possesses great speed. Now, as there is a machine with its attribute and a mechanist to direct it, I conclude that we are safe." Replied Ned Land doubtfully. At this moment, and as a customary commentary upon my remark, a disturbance arose at the stern of this strange vessel, whose mode of protrusion was evidently a screw, and it began to move. We had scarcely time to secure ourselves to the higher parts, which was about a yard out of the water. Fortunately, the speed was not great. "So long as it goes over the waves, I have no particular objection," replied Ned Land. "But if it should take a dive, I would not give $2 for my skin." The Canadian might have made even a lower estimate, but under the circumstances it was necessary to communicate with the being shut up in the machine. I looked for an opening, a panel, a manhole, to use the technical term, but the lines of rivets solidly fixed upon the joinings of the iron plates were whole and regular. Moreover, the moon deserted us and left us in profound obscurity. We were, therefore, obliged to wait for daylight to find means to penetrate into the interior of this submarine vessel. Thus, our safety depended entirely upon the caprice of the mysterious helmsman who guided this machine. If he descended, we were lost. Unless this occurred, I had no doubt of being able to communicate with the crew, and indeed, if they did not manufacture the air they breathed, they must come to the surface from time to time to replenish the supply. Thus the necessity for an aperture communicating with the outer air. We had given up all hope of being rescued by Commodore Farragut. We were proceeding westwards, and I estimated our speed at 12 miles an hour. The screw revolved regularly, sometimes emerging and throwing phosphorescent jets of water to a great height. About 4 a.m. the speed increased. We had some difficulty in resisting this giddy pace, as the waves beat upon us in full volume. Fortunately, Ned felt a large ring let into the upper part of the iron back, and we had, Fortunately, Ned felt a large ring let into the upper part of the iron back, and we fastened ourselves to it securely. This long night at length came to an end. My imperfect recollection cannot recall all the impressions of those hours. One detail comes to my mind. During certain lulls of the wind and waves, I fancied I could hear, vaguely, a sort of fugitive harmony produced by distant chords. What was, then, this mystery of submarine navigation of which the world was vainly seeking the key? What kind of being inhabited this vessel? What mechanical agency permitted them to move at such a prodigious rate? Daylight appeared. The morning mists wrapped us up in their folds, but soon dispersed. I was making a careful survey of the hull, which formed at its upper part a sort of horizontal platform, when I found myself sinking by degrees. "Thousand devils!" cried Ned Land, striking the iron a sounding blow with his foot. "Open, I say, you inhospitable travellers!" But it was no easy matter to make them hear while the screw was working. Fortunately, the descent was arrested. Suddenly, a noise, as if bars being pushed back within the boat, was heard. A plate was raised. A man appeared, uttered a singular cry, and immediately disappeared. Some time after, 8 strong fellows, with veiled faces, silently rose up and pulled us into the formidable machine. All right, so we have come to the end of our story time, so I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to come back for a game stream. I'm going to be playing Terraria, and I will let you know when I'm back. I'll type in chat to refresh. So... all right. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the beginning of the story, and now we're going to see what's inside the giant beast next stream. Will probably be next week, probably Tuesday. Pretty sure it's going to be Tuesday, but I will let you know. I have to wait for my schedule. Anyways, thanks again. I'll see you in a few minutes.